Hi, welcome. My name is Holly. I'm a manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. And right now, this is a topic of women in the Civil War. It's a big topic, and I probably should have narrowed it down to maybe women at Gettysburg, because there's a lot of women I wasn't able to include, but who knows, I might do something in the future. And I do talk about quite a few in Gettysburg. In fact, I'm at the front of the gatehouse at Evergreen Cemetery that was there during the Civil War. And this will tie into one of the women that I speak about during this presentation. So hang on, because we'll get to her, and she's definitely a shero. Here we go. There she is, Elizabeth Thorne. I'll talk about her later, but the gatehouse that you see me in front of, that is the gatehouse to the cemetery that she worked in. When the Civil War began, women, along with men, volunteered to fight for the Union, maybe not in the same role. Some of them organized ladies' aid society to supply the Union troops with things they needed, like food, and they planted gardens and canned fruit. They sewed, they washed, they knitted, they raised money. But not everybody was content with that, though that was certainly an important role. And there's certainly women that are going to be at home taking care of things there because their spouse has gone off to war. And many women wanted to take on a different role, and they were inspired by Florence Nightingale, one of my other sheroes, and nurses in the Crimean War, which really paves the way for nurses during the Civil War. They found a way to work on the front lines, caring for the sick and wounded soldiers, and keeping the rest of the troops healthy. Now, realize that traditionally during this time, it's going to be men that are out there working as nurses. Keep that in the back of your head. Farmers and plantation owners' wives, and I'm saying that because it was a different role for women then, and unfortunately, most of the time they weren't recognized themselves as being a farmer, though they might have done just as much work. But they kept the farms going and the crops growing and producing resources to feed and clothe the troops. Some women from poorer backgrounds worked in production of textiles. Women of all economic levels volunteered their time knitting, sewing, cooking, serving meals, raising funds. And but the demand for soldiers needing medical care, there weren't enough male nurses to keep up with the military's ability to provide health services. Some women opened their homes to care for soldiers, while others devoted time in churches and other buildings that housed patients. And back then, during the Civil War, almost any place could become a hospital. A small number of women with formal medical degrees found employment or volunteered their time as doctors. Some women trained as army nurses, cooks, or laundresses, and that's from women on the home front. Um, they took on so many different roles, and they are at home. Some of them are at home with the children, and yet they still have to find a way to get things done and realize that a soldier's pay was not only was it a small amount, but it wasn't always consistent in getting to the soldiers and getting it home to their spouses. And I really like this picture. It's of the 7th New York State Militia. That's the gentleman and his beloved with him there. And this is nurses and officers of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, May 1864 in Fredericksburg, Virginia. We're going to find that there's two organizations besides people that go off to be nurses that are helping to take care of the health needs. And realize medicine still has a way to go at this point because people are not, well, they don't know about need to wash their hands or wear gloves or anything like that most of the time. They needed something. The federal government in June of 1861 agreed to create a preventative hygienic and sanitary service for the Army, the United States Sanitary Commission. The Sanitary Commission's primary purpose was to fight preventable diseases and by improving conditions, particularly bad cookery and bad hygiene in Army camps. And yes, the hygiene was bad. They didn't always have great food to eat. If you ever have seen a piece of hardtack, which could be have worms in it, among other things, plus you could break your teeth unless you soaked it in something. They certainly didn't have a balanced diet. But they also provided relief to sick and wounded soldiers as much as they could. And by the end of the war, the Sanitary Commission had provided almost 15 million in supplies, the majority which had been collected by women, to the Union Army. And it wasn't just men. It was some of these was women volunteered, though it was later in the war as they get recognized and allowed to do more of their role, not just being pushed to the back, but to the forefront. Women took a lead role in the last couple of years of the war. And so here are some of them at the U.S. Sanitary Commission, nurses and officers. Now, the U.S. Christian Commission, and this is at a warehouse in Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress photo. And they're going to actually have their own division of this for a while, but eventually they also later in the war will take a more prominent role. Nurse Sophronia Buckland recalled that at Camp Letterman, which is a hospital basically that's set up for all the soldiers that are left behind at Gettysburg that were injured on both sides of the war, recalled that the organization did their work nobly and remembered that a woman from the Christian Commission would take a wagon to the countryside daily and return with generous gifts of fowls, eggs, milk, and butter. In addition to distributing food and books and clothes, they would give Bibles or prayer books as well as lead religious discussions. So this was definitely a Christian organization, not a government organization, though sometimes they competed with the Sanitary Commission, sometimes they worked hand in hand. At Camp Letterman, which again takes place after Gettysburg, there are many, many people left behind that are very ill or wounded. The Christian Commission operated 5 tents where, in addition to the normal dispersal of goods, they operated a library with shelves that were filled with reading matter that agents and nurses gave to the wounded. And later on in the war, the women were allowed to take a more of an active role. We have to realize that women had a very clearly defined role that certainly didn't espouse equality at that time. And this is from the American Battlefield Trust on the Christian Commission. So there was kind of times when they worked together and times when they were rivals, but they were there to provide for the physical and spiritual needs of the wounded. Here's something. Love the uniform here. During the Crimean War, vivandières, also referred to cantiers, traveled with regiments. And that was not in the US, by the way, as you probably know, selling spirits and other comforts while also tending to the sick and wounded. Only a few years later, and thousands of miles away, many local militia regiments in the US adopted the name Zouave and wore vivid uniforms and welcomed a daughter of the regiment into their ranks. This alternate moniker for vivandières arose because she was typically the young daughter or wife of an officer. At the war's outset, Zouaves fought with both the Union and Confederate armies. And what did they do here? Because they're not like traditional soldiers. This is what they did. They carried libations to soldiers. You can debate whether or not that was appropriate. And were commonly seen with canteens worn on shoulder straps, as you can see evidence in the picture there. Uniforms varied from regiment to regiment, but they commonly donned a knee-length skirt worn over full trousers, a tunic or jacket, and a hat along with military trim or designation of sorts. But don't let that skirt fool you. They were not fragile. Some of them were very brave women. There was one woman named Marie Tepe who was born in France and she moved to the US. When the Civil War began, her husband joined the 27th Pennsylvania. As soon as her husband left, so did Marie, despite her husband Bernard telling her to stay at the tailor shop in Philadelphia. She became a vivandière with the 27th Pennsylvania, but she's better known as the vivandière of the 114th Pennsylvania. It's a Zouave unit based on the French army. Soldiers wore a Zouave uniform, and so did Marie Tepe, who left the 27th and went to the other regiment where she wore a blue jacket and red pants. So not the dress, the skirt here. To distinguish herself from men, sometimes she would wear a skirt trimmed in red. And she was called, not a name I would pick, but that's what they called her at the time, French Mary. And she participated in the Battle of Fredericksburg. And during the battle, she received a bullet wound to the ankle. And for her bravery, she is awarded the Kearney Cross, which was awarded to valorous veterans of the 1st Division of the 3rd Army Corps in memory of its late commander, Philip Kearney. After being in the hospital a short time, she rejoined the regiment in 1863. They joined the fight at Gettysburg. And then after the battle was over, she volunteered her services as a nurse. And then she would serve throughout the rest of the war. And eventually she would move to Pittsburgh, but she would attend reunions of the soldiers of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And she died in 1901. And she went above and beyond. Now, this is a Winslow Homer print, a very well-known artist, and this is called Campaign Sketches, the picture, and it says the letter for home. Well, this nurse is writing a letter home for this soldier, an Army of the Potomac soldier in a hospital bed, and this is from the Library of Congress. And as I was mentioning to you, prior to the Civil War, excuse me, there were few women that practiced medicine. They weren't nurses, but and then the war begins, and Union and Confederate, well, they'd rather have a man there helping them with nursing. The men medical officers didn't think women had the constitution to help. How after a few months this changed as medical departments on both sides were unprepared for the number of Union soldiers that were coming to the hospitals. They didn't have enough male nurses. They need female nurses. Having sick and wounded soldiers caring for others did not work well. That's what they were doing. So guess what? Sanitary Commission and eventually the Christian Commission will step in to help, and they start to recruit female nurses to work in the hospital. Some of them joined the nursing corps, and I will tell you about the nurses, and the head of the nurses, Dorothea Dix. Other women were treating soldiers in the home area. They worked behind the scenes. Lots of times, unfortunately, Black women were assigned more tedious tasks, such as cooking, laundress, and chambermaids. I mean, that was a valuable service, but that was based on them being Black. Unfortunately, that is what the military did at that time. In many Union hospitals, the only patients they treated were African American soldiers or contrabands. Similar discrimination was seen in other northern hospitals, with lower class and immigrant women being assigned the more menial roles, which we all know is absolutely appalling. Can you imagine being a woman going off and never being in a military hospital? It's very emotionally draining. There's one nurse that has stumbled over a pile of amputated limbs. Another passed out. Another was told to stop crying because it was just so heartbreaking. But they had to choke back their tears and work. And they got divided into shifts. In DC, there's a place called the Academy Hospital. There's places in Tennessee. There's hospitals all over the place. And they would work many hours, and then they would make rounds to check on their patients, changing bandages, giving them medicine. At Armory Hospital in DC, some of these nurses worked 18-hour days. Sometimes they even made the rounds with surgeons. And I could go on and on about the role of women during the war and what the nurses in particular did. In Richmond, there's a hospital called Chimborazo there, and there was a group of nuns carrying up to 500 to 600 patients in the time. Some hospitals in DC had over 2,000 patients. There were hospitals in Fredericksburg. There are hospitals everywhere. In fact, if you've read Little Women, you know the author Louisa May Alcott, and she writes about hospital sketches. And she also writes Little Women, where the father is returning from the war, I believe, as a chaplain. But she decided to become a Civil War nurse. Now remember, hygiene was not sanitation. The idea of germs weren't discovered. You get exposed to wounded soldiers, you could pick up a disease. And so she goes off to the hospital, a Union hospital in Washington, D.C., Louisa May Alcott. And by January, she was sick with typhoid pneumonia and was so ill she was sent home, ending her career as a nurse. And that happened to nurses. They contracted many diseases over a time, and treating patients from Andersonville, infamous prison in Georgia, they could come down with something like smallpox. In Knoxville's Asylum Hospital, young lady that was helping there, Melinda McFarland Jackson, contracted smallpox and died. She was only 15. One nurse wrote, her name is Ella Wolcott. I have been a female nurse since a year ago last October and only regret that I did not go in the beginning. When a mistaken humility is all that withheld me. I went and met with many misgivings, but now I know that women are worth what women are worth in hospitals. It's no light thing to hear a man say he owes you his life and then know that mother, father, sister, or child bless you in their prayers. The Civil War allowed women to take a more active role outside the home. But remember, they are also taking a grave risk being exposed to illness and disease. So let's talk about who was the head of nurses. Dorothea Dix, Superintendent of Army Nurses. I bet you think she had a lot of experience. Guess what? She didn't. She didn't. She'd been more of a social worker, a reformer, but no, she hadn't been a nurse. And actually, Dr. Mary Walker wanted to be the head of nurses, and some other well-known women that had much more experience wanted to be in charge. But yet, Dorothea convinced them to make her in charge. And there's a picture of her. And when the Civil War breaks out, she springs into action. There was no system in place. Now, I'm not saying she didn't do some great things. And let me also point out that a lot of these women had never worked as a nurse. Of course, today, to truly be a nurse, you would have to go to college, nursing school, and have a degree and have experience. But these women are learning on the fly, as was Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix convinced the Army to create the nation's first female nursing corps under her control. Oh, she wasn't always beloved. As the superintendent of Army nurses, Dix laid out the guidelines for the female nurses, and she told you had to be, here, you'll love this, the age requirement between 35 and 50, and they had to be plain looking. If you were too pretty, you would not get picked. She forbade her nurses from wearing jewelry, makeup, curls, bows, or hoop skirts, hoop skirts. She was a very disciplined person. People didn't always particularly like her. Doctors and nurses really started to bristle when she came around, and they began to refer to her as Dragon Dix, or the dictator in a petticoat. Yes, she was very disciplined. And I definitely, there's flaws that she had that I can speak about, but I want you to also think, if she had been a man, would they have been saying all those same things? Some were deserved, perhaps not all, but I do think the whole thing about the appearance and the age is it's actually ridiculous. She expected a lot, but she also fought for them. In the Army, male nurses were paid $20.50 a month. Guess what? Female nurses got absolutely zero pay, and they're doing the same work, and they had to cover their own expenses. This convinced the government to supply the nurses with food, transportation, housing, and to pay them 40 cents a day. No way, even if they worked every day, that's only going to come out to $12. And I'm assuming once in a while they would get a day off. And then Dix would resign her commission. One of the things I learned about her was she was in 1865 at the end of the war. So she's there in June. She ends in August of 1865. Though a lot of Catholic nuns served as nurses, she was very prejudiced against them and did not work with them successfully. That is one of her definite shortcomings. However, see, she's a mix of contradictions. She worked even with both sides. She treated Union and Confederate wounded because they would end up behind the Union lines. And she was well thought of in the South. Her nurses provided what was the only care that some of the Confederate soldiers would get. A lot of the women were at home trying to tend to things because the war is taking place, with the exception of Gettysburg and Antietam, which was a divided state. It's taking place in the South. Georgina Woolsey, and Dick's nurse, said the surgeon in charge of our camp looked at all their wounds and saw that even amongst the rebels, they were dressed. Another Dick's nurse said, many of these rebels, I could not pass them by neglected. Though enemies, they were nevertheless suffering human beings. And when the Confederates left Gettysburg, they left behind 5,000 wounded soldiers, and many of them were treated by Dix's nurses. Not everybody was a Dix nurse, but the Army of the Potomac particularly, but almost all of them actually fell under her, though a few came in through other means like the sanitary, the commission, Christian Commission, and so on. Union nurse Cornelia Hancock wrote about the experience. There are no words in the English language to express the suffering I witnessed today. Dix was well respected for her work throughout the war because of her dedication. This stemmed from her putting aside her previous work to focus on the war at hand. With the conclusion of the war, her service was recognized formally. She was awarded with 2 national flags, these flags being for the care, succor, and relief of the sick and the wounded soldiers of the United States on the battlefield and camps and hospitals during the recent war. Dix ultimately founded 32 hospitals and influenced the creation of 2 others in Japan. So a mass of contradictions, but with definitely some wonderful contradictions and a couple of concerning things. I talk about some other nurses. Now there's so many nurses that I cannot do credit to. But since I am from New Hampshire, and since I have read Sarah Lowe's writing, and by the way, Dover, New Hampshire has quite a few articles, an article about her, quite long, was written, but you're not able to use it to talk about something unless you have permission. But I have visited New Hampshire Historical Society with my husband, Dwayne, and he writes about Sarah Lowe in his book, Man of Granite. Let's see if I can get it up here. I'm terrible at doing this. It's fading, but if you look, New Hampshire Soldiers in the Civil War, published by University of South Carolina Press, and I helped transcribe a lot of these. We couldn't always afford to do all the photocopying, so sometimes I just hand wrote it out, which would prove a challenge for anybody trying to read it. But I have a little bit from his book here that I would like to read to you. And Sarah Lowe is somebody that's really interesting to me. She's from Dover, New Hampshire, not far away from my home in New Hampshire, and um, just a lovely city there. But Sarah Lowe, this is from Dwayne's books, is 32 years old. I don't know how she got in there under Dorothea Dix. She must have been plain enough, they thought. And I'm not insulting her looks because I don't think that should have anything to do with nursing. But remember, the requirement was supposed to be 35. Would have agreed. Sarah left the Dr. Child. He was talking about the human wreckage after a battle. She was 32 years old and had left the comfort of her Dover home on the advice of a friend, Hannah Stevenson, working in D.C., to come and help her with the sick and wounded. Now, she had never done anything like this. Lowe arrived in the capital on September 10th, 1862, and began to work the next day by changing the bandages of New Hampshire soldiers at the Union Hotel Hospital. In letters to her mother from the hospital in Georgetown, Virginia, Sarah described the nurse's duties, but also aired her complaints about Dorothea Lind Dix. You heard about her, right? According the womanly part of the nurse's duties, some of the things that they had to do, attending the wounds, seeing the ward is kept neat, and the incompetent attendants, which were male, do their duty is wearing. But Miss Dix assumes the authority of recruiting nurses, but she also made the position of nurse uncomfortable by it so much that I could not have advised anyone to come. So yes, she did some good things, but she makes it really hard for people to be there. Skipping ahead a little bit, and quotes from Sarah are throughout the book, And this is from the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord, New Hampshire, which is a great resource of things to do with the Civil War in New Hampshire. And when I found these things from Sarah Lowe, of course, my husband utilized them in the book. She spoke to me. December 26th, Sarah Lowe wrote to her mother, yesterday, as we were giving out breakfast, the bugle sounded again. 100 more wounded had arrived, and the floor was still covered. The men speak of this battle as the greatest slaughter there has been. And this would be the Battle of Fredericksburg. And by the way, Sarah had moved to Armory Square Hospital, where she'll be for the rest of the war. Lowe was amazed with the courage of her patients. One reason that our soldiers bear suffering with such wonderful fortitude is because they are so well educated and read so much. It helps to take their thoughts from the pains. And which was interesting, the soldiers were wonderful, but having read a number of their letters along with my husband, spelling could be very creative during that time. That isn't saying that they weren't intelligent, just not good spellers. In 1864, Sarah talks about the opportunity to meet President Lincoln, because remember, she's not in the field, she's in DC, but they're still seeing horrific things. She recorded in her diary on April 20th, we attended the president's reception last night. I was never in such a crowd before. We went to the first reception room, and Mr. Hale, who I'm guessing is Senator Hale from Dover, and I think maybe on her mother's side, she was related to him somehow. Mr. Hale introduced me to the president, who said, how you do, marm? The ladies say that the reason he said so was because he thought I was Mr. Hale's venerable mother, and Mr. Hale was quite a bit older than hers. So I don't think so. I'm guessing that was a joke. Then Mr. Hale introduced me to Mrs. Lincoln. She shook hands with me and asked Mr. Hale after his family. And realized back then, I was talking last night with Dwayne about that people could just kind of show up. I mean, she was brought with a esteemed senator. She came with a esteemed senator, but people would just show up to see the president. And obviously, security was very lax. We can talk about that another time. And Sarah Lowe again says, they brought in more dreadful wounds yesterday and brought a great many dead. Some of the wounds are in dreadful condition. One arm was so mortified that the flesh dropped off and as many maggots were out. It is impossible to keep maggots from some wounds, for they multiply in less than a minute. All knee joint wounds die unless the patient is strong enough to go through amputation. Just think about that. Why am I reading this? Because it's her firsthand account, what she experienced, a young woman from Dover. And that's her in her nursing outfit, by the way. Nurse Sarah Lowe and her friends, after Lincoln is assassinated, Sarah's in DC, and they tried once to see the president's body. They tried to view the president's body on April 18th, but the crowds were too late. So this is 1865. On April 19th, Lowe said, we watched Lincoln's funeral procession come to the Capitol at 2. It was very solemn, and many persons were overcome. On April 20th, she and her friends again tried to view the remains of the president. This time they were successful. There was a long procession waiting to go in, which moved a step or two and then stopped and so on. It was a very impressive sight in the rotunda. In the dim light as we entered, we saw on one side a line of officers sitting in full, brilliant uniform. In the center was the coffin, and an officer standing at the head and foot. The flowers on the coffin that had been beautiful the day before were faded, and it seemed forlorn that they had not been replaced by fresh ones. And I know this doesn't have to do with nursing, but it has to do with the war experience. Lincoln's face looked very thin and shrunken. The face was darkened, and it seemed to me that he looked like a murdered man. And to know what happened, Sarah Lowe returned home to Dover in August of 1865 and died in December of 1913. She was the granddaughter of William Hale and the last member of the Hale family to live in the Lafayette House in Portsmouth. Senator John Parker Hale wrote to Sarah's mother that at a breakfast in Washington, Governor Merrill of New Hampshire praised Lowe. Think of it, a young lady who you see at once is educated and refined, having position, friends, homes, and parlor, which she adorned, coming here to look after and take care of those poor fellows, of whom she knows nothing except they are sick and suffering. And this gives you a little idea of what a nurse in a hospital in DC, but realize this was close to places like Maryland, Virginia. Lots of soldiers went there. I bet you all know who this is. One of my favorites. Growing up, I used to read the autobiographies, the story of Clara Barton. And this is, yep, there's me being a nerd standing at Antietam. That's a monument to her. Lots of times you'll find Civil War monuments are very creative. But what is wonderful is see something that honors a woman that served as a nurse. I wish there were many more. So Clara Barton, this is up there on the left, that is a panel that's there by the stone. It says, Clara Barton, I have been permitted to stand by your loved ones when the trial begins. For some, service to their country ended with the Civil War. I'm going to read that panel to you. For Clara Barton, this was the beginning. Barton, a 40-year-old teacher, I believe she's from Massachusetts, patent clerk, and patriot, was frustrated by reports of inadequate relief supplies at the battlefields. She gathered the needed items and transported them to the front. At Antietam, Miss Barton followed the sound of artillery and arrived on this part of the battlefield. She delivered bandages and latins to the field hospital. Clara Barton and her staff of 30 men, she's leading a group of 30 men, prepared gruel, meal mixed with warm water, which they carried out to feed the wounded and dying. It's a one-day battle, but it's pretty horrific. The highest single-day losses of any one battle. And she worked there for 3 days, providing what assistance she could. This is just one of many battlefields on which Miss Barton worked. After the war, Barton established the Friends of the Missing Men of the United States Army, an organization which located the graves of missing U.S. soldiers. She established the American Association of the International Red Cross in 1881, adding civilian disaster relief to its mandate of providing neutral assistance during war. In 1904, Clara Barton established the American First Aid Association, and she wasn't always beloved, but she got things done. And she definitely was one of my sheroes growing up. This picture on the right, this portrait, hangs in New Hampshire State House. It's of Harriet Dane. Harriet was a nurse. She did help other regiments, but she was primarily with the 2nd New Hampshire Volunteer Infantry from June 1861 to Christmas 1865. The 1st New Hampshire was only a 90-day regiment. So this is the first regiment to really go for an extended length of time. And after the war, all these regiments would meet in the Wares in New Hampshire in the summer. They each owned a house, and Harriet Dame, would be a beloved sight there. She would be with her men that she had taken care of during the battle. Harriet Dame, and this is again from Men of Granite, New Hampshire soldiers in the Civil War. Yes, I picked a couple of New Hampshire soldiers because I knew about them, and I wanted to give publicity to represent the common nurse that didn't get all the credit that they should. So Harriet Page Dame, who'd been nursing the wounded from the battle, lifted a blanket, because we're talking about a sergeant who was a casualty, Thomas Lever of Concord. Harriet Dame's going to lift that blanket and recoiled in shock. She had been a neighbor of the Lever family in Concord. That's where she was from, and had known Thomas from the time he was a boy. and Concord is the state capital. Dame carefully prepared the bodies of both soldiers. There's another one that had died, Corporal George Damon of Pennacook, which isn't that far away, and personally supervised their burial near the hospital. And one more story about Harriet Dame. Another New Hampshire notable whose reputation grew during the 7 Days battle was Harriet Patience Dame. She joined the 2nd New Hampshire soon after it left the state, and unlike other nurses, she accompanied the regiment into the field. I think nurses are heroes, sheroes, but to be on the battlefield, she was seen throughout the war, nursing the wounded of not only the 2nd New Hampshire, but also other New Hampshire regiments as well. She had no reservations about nursing the sick and wounded, even though a battle was in progress around her. The Confederates twice captured Dame during the 7 Days and Second Bull Run. After the Battle of Malvern Hill, Dame had lost her way and she stumbled into a Confederate picket line, a place you don't want to be. When she was taken to a Confederate officer, the following polite exchange occurred. Confederate officer, going, got too far into Dixie, hey? Dame, not as far as I'm going. Confederate officer, how far are you going? Dame says, as far as Richmond. Confederate officer, going as a prisoner? Dame, no, I'm going under the old flag, the United States flag. At the end of this conversation, the officer was so exasperated with Dame's impertinence that he released her because it was apparent from her supplies that she was a nurse who had been tending the wounded and not a great threat to the Confederacy. The second time Dame was captured, she was brought before no less a personality than Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. When brought to his tent, he silently regarded her at a moment, looked at her medical equipment, and then erupted into a towering rage. His anger was not directed at Dame, but at her captors. Take that lady back to the northern lines. The soldiers quickly ushered Dame out of the tent and politely escorted her back to the lines. And as I told you, after the end of the war, she would go to those reunions in Wares Beach near Laconia, New Hampshire. After the war, Dame held a clerical position in the United States Treasury and was a yearly visitor at those post-war reunions. She worked at the Treasury for 28 years until she became an invalid in 1895. Dame died in 1900 in Concord, and the governor of the state, Frank Rollins, led a large funeral procession to the cemetery. The next year, the state appropriated money to have a portrait of Dame painted. When it was completed, it became the first painting of a woman to hang in the New Hampshire State House. But let me tell you something. I mean, and I think she deserves that honor. However, if you look over here on the left, that is what Harriet Dame looked like when she was serving during the war. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. Oh gosh, I could do a whole presentation on her. She graduated from Syracuse Medical School in 1855, one of the first women doctors in the nation, the first woman to graduate from medical school 6 years before, who I also used to read about, was Elizabeth Blackwell. When the Civil War began, Walker was an abolitionist, went to Washington, D.C. to volunteer her medical services for the Union. She was told she couldn't officially join up as a doctor because she was a woman. Undeterred, Walker made the rounds in the Washington, D.C. hospitals, volunteering where she could, even going to battlefields. Holy cow. Finally, in 1863, Walker was assigned to a contract position as a surgeon with the 52nd Ohio Volunteers. She was determined to serve. This made her the first woman physician employed by the U.S. military. Walker wore a bloomer uniform she designed, and after a few months, she was captured, held as a Union spy after crossing battle lines to treat civilians in Confederate held territory. She was held over 3 months in Castle Thunder, a notorious prison near Richmond, Virginia. And let me tell you something. I didn't put a lot on there, but she went through what I would call hell. when she was there. She was a very brave, determined woman. And remember, she wore bloomers. That was not looked upon. Her family was had a very a liberated mindset. So she at the war's end, she is presented. By the way, after 3 months, she's released with a Congressional Medal of Honor for devoting herself with such patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded soldiers. By the way, she was given a Bible when she leaves that terrible place that she held on to because it was addressed to Dr. Mary Walker. A lot of her co-workers would not call her doctor. She was active in so many things, including workers' rights, veterans' compensation, and women's equality. And she tried to register to vote, which was denied. We know that's going to be way down the road. She had what was considered many radical positions through her life. She goes on the lecture circuit. She's attacked in public for wearing pants. She was called unnatural for her interest in practicing medicine. But this is the worst thing that happens to her. Medal of Honors. Today, we think of somebody going rescuing, laying down their own life, putting their own life at risk. There were different reasons that Medal of Honors were given out at the time. Did Mary Walker do some amazing things as a woman that's captured, that goes to serve with the troops as a rare female doctor? She did some incredible things, but this is what happens. She's being attacked. She's being called unnatural. Her character is maligned wherever it could be. And even some other suffragists, people that believe in women having the same rights, refused to acknowledge her. But she kept on working for those rights. But in 1917, this is very upsetting to her. That Medal of Honor, you can see her in that picture there wearing it, right? Guess what? Congress is going to take some of them back. I mean, there was a regiment. I can't even remember who they are. There's a book written about them, but they're all given the Medal of Honor for reenlisting. Many of those Medal of Honors given for the reasons that are well deserved. There are a few that aren't. So Congress declared that non-combatants, this is one of the things, because she didn't actually fight, but wow, she fought for people's rights and for hygiene and sanitation and to save people from dying. But no matter what, Congress said, you got to give it back. Guess what Mary Walker said? Nope, it's not going to happen. I'm not giving it back. And as she got older, she was considered more and more eccentric, and she refuses to return it. And she bore that for the rest of her life. By the time she dies in 1919, she had helped in the fight to abolish slavery. I mean, she was a very strong woman. She was, which thankfully she was. But so that was one of her things she believed should be abolished. She wanted pants for women. Paris fashion houses had introduced them. They were called harem trousers, and women's suffrage was gaining traction. And actually, the 19th Amendment is ratified 18 months after a death. And I think that's Tennessee that actually has that happen. She wasn't the original new woman. She was one of the first, paving the way for pants-wearing, voting activist new women. And guess what? In 1977, that Medal of Honor was reinstated, and she deserved it. But I will be honest, she is considered more and more eccentric as time goes on because she wasn't just like everybody else. Some spies, and this one was a tough one because there's Confederate spies, there's Union spies. I'm going to tell you about one. This is a Confederate spy named Rose O'Neill Greenhow. And this is her daughter, Little Rose. She actually has 4 daughters. And they are held here in the jail in the old Capitol in Washington, D.C. She is a Confederate spy. She was a socialite. She is very friendly with some well-known politicians from the South. And she has a spy network in Washington, D.C. She was given credit for ensuring the first victory at the Battle of First Manassas, her first Bull Run. They found out information. She's in DC. They found out information's being leaked, and the trail led to her house. And she's a subject to house arrest. And when they found out she was continuing her activities, she was in prison for nearly 5 months with her daughter in the old Capitol. And then she was deported to the Confederacy when she traveled to Richmond. And then she goes to Europe. And eventually, when she's trying to return in 1864 off the coast of Wilmington, North Carolina, she drowned with her rowboat overturned as she tried to escape a Union gunboat. There were several women, North and South alike, that were spies. There's a woman called Elizabeth Van Loo, excuse me, and she did work in the North, but she lived in the South, and she's raised by a family that, even though they're living in Richmond, they are abolitionists. She did things like she was able to free family slaves, reunite them with their spouses. So her family wasn't, her uncle's side of the family in Philadelphia were abolitionists. Her father's family was not, but she came back home to Richmond with those views. She freed the family slaves. She reunited them with their spouses. She participated in the Underground Railroad. And she also was able to leak information because she's still living in the South, though pretty quickly they get a clue that she's not a Confederate sympathizer. And she actually works with Ulysses S. Grant about during the siege of Richmond, and apparently passed along a lot of information to various Northern generals. And there are women on both sides of Union and Confederate that spied for their respective governments during the war. And that's just one of them. Elizabeth Van Loo, another. Not a role that people always give females credit for. I did a presentation on this lady a few months ago. This is Harriet Tubman. Harriet personally led at least 70 enslaved people to freedom, instructing her parents and dozens of others, many who were family members, how to escape on their own. She exclaimed, "I never ran a train off the track," because this is the Underground Railroad, "and I never lost a passenger." When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet found new ways to fight slavery, and she was recruited to assist fugitive enslaved people at Fort Monroe. And she worked there as a nurse, a cook, a laundress, and she had a great knowledge of herbal medicines to treat sick soldiers and fugitive enslaved people. And in 1863, she became the head of espionage, a spy network and scout network for the Union Army. And she provided crucial intelligence to the Union Army. She actually takes part in a battle, and she provided intelligence to the Union commanders about Confederate Army supply routes. And she'd actually helps liberate enslaved people to form Black Union regiments. Harriet Tubman, another one of my sheroes. Here's another one. And realize when I talk about people, it doesn't mean they were perfect. And sometimes they have conflicting beliefs, which is sometimes hard. But Harriet Beecher Stowe, I'm just going to talk about her in reference to her role in the Civil War. And that is that she writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which today we would would have a lot of misconceptions. We would find it kind of prejudice, but at the time, it was considered a great work that would help lead us into the Civil War. As she says, she has a visions when she's sitting in the First Parish Church in Brunswick, Maine, place well worth visiting, by the way. And she writes it in serial form. She gets it published. And at one point, Lincoln says to her, when he meets her, and then it's published in 1852, the Civil War starts in 1861, but it's leading up to it for quite some time. You're the great lady. You're the little lady who started this great war. Yes, that sounds a little condescending too. But that is one of the things that people believe led to the war between the states, the Civil War. She certainly, one other thing she did when she was in Brunswick was helped an enslaved person through the Underground Railroad, and her home was on the Underground Railroad for the 2 years that she lived there. So realize I'm picking and choosing. There's so many more women, so many more roles, and the roles of women at home. I wanted to talk. I didn't get to this, but about some of the wives that were left behind and what they went through when their spouse was gone. So female soldiers here, and we're going to be wrapping up in about 10 minutes here. Women stood a smaller chance of being discovered than you might think because many people fought in the war with citizen soldiers with no military training. So it wasn't like all the men really knew what they were doing any more than the women. And so there was so many Victorian sentiments at the time that even men amongst other men would bathe separately, sleep clothed, and avoid public latrines. So it did happen. And they had heavy, often wool, ill-fitting clothing to hide their shape, and many women in uniform were still discovered often after being wounded in battle. For example, Clara Barton, who went on to found the Red Cross, discovered Mary Galloway's identity while treating a chest wound Galloway had suffered at the Battle of Antietam, which is where Clara Barton came to prominence. Finding a woman in the ranks would generally bring a welcome dose of distraction and rumor to camp life. Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, who had listed under the name Private Lyons Wakeman, on the other hand, was not discovered at any point during almost 2 years of service. What do you think about that? And even falling ill during the Red River campaign and almost dying in New Orleans hospital, and realized that a lot of people there, they're not dying from wounds, including the soldiers, they're dying from disease. She almost died of chronic diarrhea, but her secret remains secure until the discovery of her letters home in 1976. And there she is. She remains buried in the Chalmette National Cemetery under her assumed name. And I know she had a hellacious experience in New Orleans. Here's another woman, as a woman and as a soldier. Sarah Emma Edmonds, also known as Franklin Flint Thompson of the 2nd Michigan Infantry. I only could thank God that I was free and could go to work, and I was not obliged to stay home and weep. Edmonds holds the honor of being the only woman to receive a veteran's pension after the war. Francis Clayton served with the 4th Missouri Artillery and was wounded at the Battle of Shiloh and again at the Battle of Stones River or Murfreesboro. Loretta Jane Velasquez served the Confederacy as a fighter and a spy, Lieutenant Harry Buford. And this is Francis Clayton's pictures. And here's Albert Cash here, which has, there's a lot more women than I'm talking about that goes, but he seems to have drawn a lot of attention. He's born in Ireland, and not much is known about his early account because by the time he's talking about it, it's 1913 and he has dementia. But this much is certain. He's a resident of Belvidere, Illinois. He enlisted in the 95th Illinois, although he was the shortest soldier in the regiment and kept mostly to himself. He was accepted as one of the boys and considered to be a good soldier. His regiment was part of the Army of Tennessee and fought in over 40 engagements, including the Siege of Vicksburg, the Battle of Nashville, the Red River Campaign, which was particularly brutal, the battles at Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia, and Jonesboro, Georgia. There's an account of Cashier being captured and escaping by overpowering a prison guard, but no further details exist of this event. He served a 3-year enlistment with his regiment until they were all mustered out on August 17th, 1865, after losing a total of 289 soldiers to death and disease. After the war, he returns to Illinois, where he settled in Sonneman. I'm sorry if I messed that up, people from Illinois. He continued his identity as a man and held many different jobs, but he is a female. farmhand, church janitor, cemetery worker, streetlight lamper. He also lamplighter. He also voted in elections at the time when women didn't have the ability to do so. They didn't have the right. And in 1910, Cashier was hit by a car and broke his leg, at which time his sex assigned at birth was discovered. The local hospital agreed not to divulge his sex assignment, and he was sent to the Soldiers in Salem home in Quincy, Illinois to recover, and he remained a resident of the home until March of 1913, when, due to onset of dementia, he's sent to the state hospital for the insane. Attendants there discovered his sex assignment and forced him to wear a dress. Pretty nervy of them. I'm not joking either. After all that time, the press got a hold of the story, and soon everyone knew that Private Albert Cashier was born as Jenny Hodgers. Many of his former comrades, although initially surprised at this revelation, were supportive of Cashier and protested his treatment at the state hospital. I find it appalling. When Cashier died on October 10th, 1915, he was buried in his full uniform and given a tombstone and inscribed with his male identity and military service. And here's something. This says Chad Freeman. I've found this. He's discharged. Why? Because of sexual incompatibility. So someone found out that he was, after being in service for 16 weeks, that he was a she. I thought you might enjoy that. And this is a young woman. There's a sign in front of a home, and her name is Tilly Pierce, and she wrote a book called At Gettysburg, What a Girl Saw and Heard of the Battle, a true narrative. It was published more than a quarter of a century after the Battle of Gettysburg, and it tells about her experiences. And that sign will give you a little overview because it's in front of a bread and breakfast, I believe, because it's actually where, when they break out in her hometown, by the way, her brothers had already enlisted in the Army. In June of 1863, they hear that the Confederate troops had reached Chambersburg near Gettysburg. And a week later, she's taking her lessons at a ladies' seminary and instructed to run home with her sister because Confederate troops were on the outside of Gettysburg. She arrived just as the Confederate troops were beginning their removal of horses, food, and other supplies. She saw they stand on the street and they sang with her friends. She sang Our Union Forever. And they go watch the Confederates filing in on July 1st. But now there's smoke and firing from Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg. And by that time, her parents are worried. So they're going to send her to a safer place, a farm owned by Jacob Weichert, the father of one of the family's neighbors. And that their neighbor next door, Mrs. Schreiber, and her children would go with her. The Weichert farm, she was told, was located near the foot of a rocky hill south of Gettysburg, known as Round Top. Well, there's going to be Little Round Top, and that's going to be a lot of fighting. What her parents could not know was as the Battle of Gettysburg raged over the next 3 days, their daughter would be witnessing that intense fighting, but also be called on to help. She helped the Army surgeons with the fallen men. When she gets there, she can see what's happening on Seminary Ridge. She brings bucket of water. There's soldiers in the basement. A chaplain told her, little girl, do all that you can for these soldiers and God will reward you. I mean, so much is happening around her. She's actually in a much more dangerous position than if she had stayed at home. They were caught one day, sometime between 4 and 5 p.m. Pierce and her friends are caught between opposing forces. She went through a lot for such a young woman. And she sits with the soldiers, and she sits with General Stephen Weed, and he dies the next day. And yeah, if you visit Little Round Top, when it opens back up, it's closed, I believe, till July. She had brought him a piece of bread. And finally, she's able to go back home. Then she goes to her house where there are more wounded soldiers that the family helps care of. Listen, one person they take care of is there for months in their house. So she says, after about 3 years after the battle, I was standing on the front pavement one day when a carriage suddenly stopped at the door. A gentleman alighted, came up to me, shook hands, and kissed me without saying a word. I knew it was the colonel, the one that they had cared for. Colonel William Colville of the 1st Minnesota Regiment. So that book is out there. It's a really interesting book. At Gettysburg, or What a Girl Saw and Heard at the Battle. An amazing young woman, Billy Pierce. And then we're wrapping it up. This is Jenny Wade, Mary Virginia Wade. She's the only civilian casualty of the battle, and she was killed by a stray bullet on July 3rd, 1863. There is a little place there, home that you can visit. I haven't been there for over 20 years, but Jenny Wade, Virginia Wade, is an interesting young woman. She was born in Gettysburg. She works with her mother as a seamstress. Her father was mental asylum. It was believed she was engaged to John Hastings, Jack Skelly, a corporal in the 87th Pennsylvania, who'd been wounded 2 weeks earlier in the Battle of Winchester. He will die of his injuries on July 12th. Wade, her mother, and younger brothers left their home in central Gettysburg and went to the house of her sister, Georgia Ann Wade McClellan, on Baltimore Street, which is right on the main drag there, not that far from the battlefield. And during the first day's fighting, more than 150 bullets hit the house she is in. About 8 o'clock on July 3rd, Wade was kneading dough for bread when a mini ball, and that has that, it's just designed to do as much damage as possible, traveled through the kitchen door and the parlor of her sister's home and hit her. It pierced her left shoulder blade, went through her heart, and ended up in her corset. She was killed instantly. While it was uncertain which side fired the fatal shot, of course, believed it was a Confederate shooter. Her mother heard her fall to the floor and went to tell her sister Georgia in the other room that her sister had been shot dead. 2 Union soldiers came in from upstairs when they heard the screams of the women, and they temporarily buried her body in the backyard of the McClellan house in a coffin intended originally for Confederate General William Barksdale. In January of 1864, her body was relocated to the cemetery, and her final resting place became Evergreen Cemetery. Many people are buried there: Gettysburg, Jenny Wade, and I do have one more person after that, but Jenny, innocently kneading bread when that happened. And she and her supposed fiance never knew what had happened to the other. The last woman I'm going to talk about. Go to that Evergreen Cemetery. Why this is called the Gettysburg Woman Memorial by one of my favorite sculptors, Ron Tunison. This is a woman named Elizabeth Sorn. She was expecting her fourth child in the summer of 1863, and her husband was in charge of the gatehouse there. This woman was born in Germany. She and her husband came to the U.S. through Ellis Island, and her husband had accepted employment as the caretaker of the cemetery. They paid no rent. His parents move in. He goes off to war, the 138th Pennsylvania, and she has 3 small sons, and they're going to take care of that cemetery because her husband can't. A Confederate invasion happens in June 26, 1863, and she was busy with her duties with her aged father as the only assistant. There are malnourished soldiers showing up to the gatehouse and asking for food. And Catherine, Elizabeth's mother, quickly complies. And as the men sat near the cemetery, another Confederate rode up to them, holding the reins of a riderless horse. And actually, that soldier, and he says that he shot somebody that shot at him. And it was actually the first Union soldier to be killed at Gettysburg. Thousands more would follow. The Confederate invaders left Gettysburg the following day. But guess what? She looks out the window and she sees um, a battle going on. And then Union troops show up. General Howard, Oliver Otis Howard, the Christian general, that was his name, from Maine. She helps direct them, get them directions to places that they need at that point. And guess what? They come back later. General Howard, General Sickles, the man that's going to have his leg blown off, guy from New York, who uses the first insanity offense in a trial and wins. This is before the war. And Slocum, some very well-known generals, and they cleaned out her pantry. It was a very a humble meal. She didn't have a lot of food, and the sons were interested in General Howard in particular because he had lost an arm during the Battle of Severn Pines the year before. General Howard warns Elizabeth that it'd be hard fighting the next day and get to the cellar. And then he told her to leave the house, take nothing but the children, and go. So they hurried down there. And Elizabeth, remember, she's pregnant, but they'd have to go back. They didn't take any supplies. They just went. So they go back near her home. And then they found out their home had been ransacked. Union soldiers were everywhere. It was a house for the Union and the dead. The pigs were gone. There was nothing. The only thing she could find was her mother's shawl. Her parents returned to their farmhouse, and then her family walked to this other farm where her parents were staying as well. And they remained at this farm throughout July 3rd. On that day was the last day of the Battle of Gettysburg. She learns a friend, Jenny Wade, is killed. And on July 7th, Elizabeth makes her journey back to their home on Cemetery Hill. The house was gutted. The furniture had been taken by Union troops. She was unable to retrieve any family belongings. Windows were shattered. Blood, stench, water pump was broken. It was just horrible. And then the president of the Evergreen Cemetery says, "You've got these corpses to build." With only a father to help, Elizabeth buried 91 soldiers and several civilians who had died in the interim on Cemetery Hill. The 30-year-old expectant mother worked intensely without complaining. And remember, it's very hot. And of the 91 soldiers buried by Elizabeth, 66 remained there. It's just her and her father. And she was so caught up in what she was doing, she wore the same dress for 6 weeks. After the 3 months after the battle, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl. She named the baby Rose Meade in honor of Union Army Commander George Meade. She was never of good health, the child, and she died at the age of 14. Peter Thorne, her husband, survived the war and returned to Gettysburg, resuming his duties as caretaker. They had 5 more children born to them. The only thing they had left from the Battle of Gettysburg was the family clock. And so Elizabeth Thorne, born on the other side of the world in Germany, is an American citizen. And she did a job that most of us would absolutely refuse to do. War really takes a toll on people. And this woman cared for the remains of those young men when their own mothers couldn't. So next month, quickly, got some good stuff coming up. Ryan is going to do one of his amazing presentations the first Tuesday in May. The first full Wednesday in May. And then the third Tuesday in May, join me because I'm going to talk about one of my other sheroes, Amelia Earhart. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the Lincoln assassination in June. Here's some of my sources and some books. I have all the it's not Al, it's all the daring of a soldier by Elizabeth Leonard. She's written a couple of books. I have a lot more books about women in war. Dwayne's book, Men of Granite, so many great articles, Smithsonian, history sites, everything that I know I could vet as much as possible. So much more I wanted to say, but I hope this inspires you to go look up and hear more about these women because they were amazing. Thank you. I'll see you next month. Bye.